Hi, my name's Brian McLaren. It's a pleasure to be with you. This is my first opportunity to be in a dialogue with Dr. Richard Land in public like this, and I'm really looking forward to this. Just a bit about myself as we get started. I started my career as a college English teacher, then I became a pastor for 24 years. I pastored an interdenominational Christian church in the Washington, D.C. area. During that time, I was involved in a lot of international mission work. I was the chairman of the board of a mission agency. And during that time, I began writing some books, and over the last 10 years, I've written about a dozen books. A couple of years ago, I left pastoral ministry, so now I'm a member of the church that I planted and helped lead for many years. And I've been involved in speaking about faith and public life and the challenges the church faces as we enter a time of great, profound cultural change. My website is brianmclaren.net if you're interested in finding out more about me. And Richard, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Richard Land. I'm have been for the last 20 years the president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the public policy agency of the convention. We are assigned the responsibility to speak about religious liberty issues, human rights issues, moral, social, public policy, and ethical issues. Prior to that time, I was a professor in a college. I've been pastor of two Baptist churches, one in the French Quarter of New Orleans, one in Oxford, England, when I was doing my PhD at Oxford. I've written books. I have two radio programs, Richard Land Live and For Faith and Family. And my website is richardlandlive.com. And if you want to know more information about the things that I do during the week and the things that I'm seeking to address. And I blog at castingstones.blog. And one thing that Brian and I have in common is that we both were named as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals by Time magazine in 2005. And the surprise of that and the pleasure, at least to our loved ones of that, was mitigated a little bit by the fact that I think several of the so-called evangelicals weren't even Protestants, and a couple were Catholics, and it showed the Times limited repertoire when it came to evangelicals. But my parents were pleased to hear this. And Brian, I don't know about you, but I didn't find out until the Monday morning that it came out. My staff had kept it from me, and so I get a phone call at 7:30 in the morning. They had done a picture a couple of weeks earlier, but they said it was just for Time. And so I get a phone call, and one of my staff members says, Dr. Lynn, I guess you've heard about Time. And I said, no. Is this good news or bad news? And he said, well, you've been named one of the 25 most influential evangelicals. And it was nice. I don't think I am one of the 25 most influential evangelicals, but it's nice that my mother gets to hear that Time thinks so.
Well, yeah, Richard, my experience was quite similar. I knew nothing about this until the Wednesday before the article came out. 10 o'clock at night, I get a phone call saying, we need to do a photo shoot tomorrow. I said, what for? I don't know anything about this. They said, oh, it's for Time magazine. I said, well, what's it about? My first thought was, am I in trouble for something? And they said they had no idea. I'm a photographer. I don't know anything about it. I just need to take your picture. So that was my introduction, and I still didn't really know what it was about until probably Sunday when they called me one last time to make sure that they'd chosen the right photograph. So, the irony for me in this was most of the people on the list had never even heard of me. So I think I was probably the least likely candidate for the list. But one nice thing about it is it brings us together now.
Well, Brian, I had heard of you before the Time magazine naming of you as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals. But Brian, before we get too far into our discussion, labels get thrown around, and I think it would be helpful for those who will be listening and watching this for us to have a discussion about what we mean by conservative and liberal and progressive.
Yeah. That's a great place to start. One of my real concerns with this, whenever discussions happen in the world of theology, first of all, because the words liberal, conservative, progressive, they all have a big meaning in the world of theology. But then when you bring that into the media and public policy and all the rest, people have a lot of different definitions about those words. Often when I'm interviewed on a radio or TV show, they'll ask me something using the word conservative or liberal, and I know you're not supposed to do this on an interview, but I very often say, well, what do you mean by the term? I understand that old bipolarity between left and right goes all the way back to after the French Revolution, and they seated two parties on either side of the room, and that's where those words came up, originated. But for me as a Christian, I see value and I see something good in both words. I want to be conservative and I want to be progressive or liberal. In this sense, the word conservative suggests that there are precious, important things from the past that we don't want to throw away lightly. We want to conserve everything that's good. I also think there are certain character traits that go along with that kind of conservative mindset. There are things like being frugal, not being wasteful, not throwing things away easily. That's a value that I have in my personal life. And in the same way, the word liberal has the idea of we want to free people. We want to liberate people. We want to liberate them from bad ideas, backward thinking, ignorance. We want to liberate them from oppression, injustice, and so on. And the word progressive, to me, whenever we use the word hope, we have the idea that the future can be better than the present and the past. And so it seems to me both of those words have a lot of value, but you and I both know they end up also being a kind of a shortcut for thinking for people, especially sometimes reporters who are just in the habit of telling the story of fights. So they think it's good television if every conversation ends up looking like Jerry Springer. And that's, maybe that is good television, but I think you and I would agree it's not good conversation, and it doesn't help us in being good followers of Christ in that either.
No, it doesn't. And, I think it actually does a disservice to the country, because I think that cable television and a lot of talk radio leads the country to think that we're more divided than we actually are on lots of core issues. And, this was, I wrote my book, The Divided States of America, ? What liberals and conservatives are getting wrong in the God and country shouting match. Precisely the night that I decided to write it was when I was pre-interviewed for a program, a national program, about Pope John Paul II. And they asked me, they said, now, what do you think about Pope John Paul II on a pre-interview? And I said, well, I think he's one of the transcendent historical and moral figures of the 20th century. And they said, well, that's not quite what we're looking for. And I said, well, what are you looking for? And they said, well, we're looking for an evangelical who will come on the program and say that he's the head of a false religion. Well, unfortunately, they found someone who did it. And I thought, millions and millions of Catholics and other interested observers have just gotten a false impression about what most evangelicals think about Pope John Paul II and about their faith. And so I said, look, I'm going to write this book, and I'm going to try to go over the heads of those who try to do this, what I call yin and yang journalism, where they get the two people with the loudest mouths and often the smallest brains to yell at each other for 30 minutes, and they think that that's balanced journalism. And so I think you have to define what you mean by conservative. You have to define what you mean by liberal or progressive. I have people tell me all the time. I had one of my friends tell me recently, well, Richard, you know what your problem is? And I said, well, I'm aware of several. Which one do you have in mind? And he said, you're too conservative for the liberals, and you're too liberal for the conservatives. And I said, well, that's just, I'm just going to have to continue calling them as I see them. And, even back when I was in seminary, I was called a liberal on civil rights because I thought that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a personal hero and a man of transcendent courage and was absolutely essential to helping us get beyond our segregation and racial captivity to move toward racial justice. And, people say, well, you're just a liberal. And I said, well, if being liberal means that you're for racial equality and racial reconciliation, then I plead guilty.
See, this already I think you and I have, we've crossed some lines, haven't we? Because we're saying, as committed Christians, who many people would see on different ends of that polarity, here we're saying we think there's value on both sides, and we're saying that we think that there's real harm done when people put these kind of left-right bipolarities as fundamental facts of the universe. And I think you'd probably agree too, Richard, that when we talk about being agents of reconciliation. When Jesus calls us to be peacemakers, the wound of left versus right ideology can be one of the things we're trying to heal. One of the misconceptions, stereotypes, one of the tools of prejudice that we're trying to overcome. I think we'd be in agreement in that, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, look, the media, most of the media doesn't understand us. They don't understand evangelicals in particular. They don't understand religion in general. That's been my impression. That the people who, for whatever reasons, go into media, in the secular media, in the electronic and print media, they are, as a group, less religious than the general population.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that may have, the sociologists might tell us that has something to do with, the new class of information dispensers, and there's been a lot of theorizing about that. But the reality is, if you go into a local television station, or you go into a newsroom of a network, or you go into a newspaper editorial office, these people are, in general, less religious than the culture they're reporting on. And I think that they do try to characterize and categorize people into particular slots, and when you don't fit those slots, then they just ignore what you say on those issues, or they go to other issues, other people. For instance, I wrote a book in 1992 called "The Earth is the Lord's," in which I talked about how important it was for Christians to be involved in creation care. Well, and the fact is, when I talk about that issue, it doesn't get reported on in the press.
Yeah.
When I talk about sanctity of human life, when I talk about traditional marriage, when I talk about those issues, I do get reported on in the press. And so I think it's important. I don't think there's enough dialogue going on between people of faith in this country, and we need to encourage it.
Well, we aren't going to be able to throw any chairs or call each other any names, but let's jump in a little deeper. What do you think? Give me a couple of things that you think progressives could learn from conservatives and vice versa.
Well, let me start with the vice versa part, because I wrote a whole chapter in my book on what conservatives are getting wrong. And basically I could boil it down to this. Conservatives too often assume that God is on their side, both politically and in terms of faith, and that God's on America's side. And that is idolatry. It is if it concerns your country, it's idolatry. It seems to me that what we have to try very hard to do is what Lincoln strove for when he said we need to do our very best to make certain that we're on God's side.
That's right.
And I think that when we put anything, when we put loyalty to our family, loyalty to our country, loyalty to anything above our loyalty to Jesus Christ and being a disciple of Christ, quite simply, that's idolatry. And we can't assume that God agrees with us. We need to, in every instance, try to make certain that we are in agreement with God. And then on the other side, I wrote a chapter on what I think the liberals are getting wrong, and what I think the liberals too often do is that they assume God doesn't have a side, or that if God has a side, that because of their understanding of separation of church and state, that God doesn't have a right to have his side heard on the issues. Now, I'm willing to acknowledge God may not have a side when it comes to NAFTA and it comes to CAFTA, or other trade agreements, or the precise nature of the balance of trade, or the next round of the Doha trade negotiations. But when it comes to the sanctity of human life, from conception to natural death and everywhere in between, I believe God has a side, and we ought to do our very best to be on it.
Yeah. That's, I think, you've said a couple of things there, Richard, that I think are quite significant. And it's interesting, when you look back in American religious history, we can watch these terms liberal and conservative flip around on some of these things. My friend Diana Butler Bass, who's an American church historian, says that in the first half of the 20th century, it was the liberal Protestants who represented the civil religion of America. They were the ones who, if we were going to go off to war, it would be an Episcopal or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran minister praying for the troops. The Baptists and the Pentecostals, were pushed over to the side. But that in the last couple of decades, we've seen a kind of changing of the guard, and there are a lot of ways you can describe how that happened. But I think it's interesting to think that now this is a danger in our conservative churches, that we've gotten, we've mixed our sense of American national interest, which can be very deeply mixed with our own sense of personal financial interest, with what God's interest would be. I think that's a very, very powerful thing, and I worry. Sometimes I see, quote, liberal Christians, and you get the feeling they just want to get control again, so that they can be the civil religion again. But what you're suggesting is a role for Christian faith that is deeply loves our country, deeply engaged with our country, but isn't afraid to critique our country and to say, and to raise the question you raised and Abraham Lincoln raised, are we on God's side? Very, very well put.
Well, and I think also, I know you've had contact with Muslims in both in this country and in other countries, as I have as well, particularly in my service on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I find that Muslims have a very false impression outside America of America, and the reason is because when you look at our popular culture and you look at our entertainment, it's difficult for them to conceive that we're a religious country.
Yes.
But I find that their attitude toward America improves when they discover that we are a significantly religious country. 61% of Americans think religion is very important in their lives, according to the Pew Research, and that we are just as horrified and just as mortified by the pornography and by the casual sexuality and the violence in our culture as they are. I find this improves U.S.-Muslim relations.
It's a great point. This is a tangent, but it's really worth bringing up. I don't know if you've seen this new book that was just put out by Gallup called Who Speaks for Islam? But they did the biggest study of human beings ever done. They studied 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, and some of the findings are absolutely staggering. And one of them is exactly what you've said. When our president a couple of years ago said that they, meaning Muslims, or at least extremist Muslims, hate our way of life, he actually had it just about completely wrong. That when you ask Muslims around the world what they admire about America, they admire our freedom, they admire our freedom of speech, free press, they admire our economic and technological advancement. When you ask them what they dislike about America, it's our low moral standards, our high divorce rate, our lack of respect for the elderly, the somewhat pornographic content of even our mass media, and the sense that wherever our influence goes, it doesn't bring wholesomeness, and it brings this kind of tawdriness. And of course, many of us, we would be in complete agreement. And so this is where these kinds of divides, whether it's left, right, liberal, progressive, liberal, conservative, progressive, conservative, or even Christian, Muslim, we can, in such dangerous ways, reinforce fear, misconceptions. But then we really do have some areas, I think, where we see things differently. Could I bring up an issue that I think liberals could learn something from conservatives and vice versa? I think that today, I don't think this necessarily would have been true 50 years ago, but what I hear a lot of my conservative friends say today is that they're against government, or what they say is they're against big government. You've probably heard that neoconservative line, we want government to be small enough that we could put it in a bathtub and drown it, I think was the exact words. So there's this sense that government is bad because it taxes us and it's inefficient, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, then the assumption is that liberals or progressives like big, wasteful, ineffective government, which I don't really think. I've never met a liberal who loves paying needless taxes. But the flip side of that is that conservatives seem to be pro-business, meaning that whatever is good for business, we're basically for. And what I see on the liberal side is almost the opposite: a much greater confidence in government and much less confidence in unregulated business. I'll tell you my personal thought on this. I'd love to hear what you think. I'm suspicious of anybody who's unaccountable. If government is unaccountable, I think we have to have accountability. If business is unaccountable, I think we have to have accountability. And this to me is one of those places where the left, right, liberal, conservative polarity just keeps us in dysfunction.
Well, look, and I think that one of the places where our labels cause us to have real problems getting at an issue is that there are different kinds of conservatives, and there are different kinds of liberals. There are libertarian conservatives who really detest people like me as a social conservative. Because I believe that government does have a role to play, and I think that's one of the differences between Reaganism and Bushism, in that Reaganism really did think that government is bad and it was a necessary evil, and you ought to keep it as small as possible, where George W. Bush says, look, government can help empower people to make decisions for themselves. On the left, you have people who really who are really total relativists morally, and who are very uncomfortable with any absolutes. And then you have others who are what I call social liberals, who believe government does have a role to play. And some of the strangest times of meetings that I've had is when I've been involved in anti-gambling coalitions, and what you get are people that are never in the room together, who are together in the room, social conservatives and social liberals who understand that gambling is the most regressive tax in America. Now, libertarians would tell you it's a stupid tax. I've had them tell me this, that gambling is a stupid tax, and that we tax stupid people by taking from them, because all the odds are against them in legalized gambling, where the government becomes a bookie. Whereas social conservatives and social liberals, first of all, understand that it's a terribly regressive tax that's terribly hurtful to the poor and to the marginal in our society, and it disgraces government when you put government in the role of a bookie who is promoting a destructive social activity because it gets a cut of the action. So I think that this is where the labels cause us real problems, and I agree with you about the accountability issue. My model for the best balance is the same balance we have in our government. We have a system of checks and balances where we have the judiciary, we have the executive branch, and we have the congressional branch. And I would liken those in our economy to the free enterprise system being the executive branch. The government is the congressional branch, and the labor unions are sort of like the judicial branch. If you give business absolute freedom, they're going to exploit people, and they're going to take advantage of people. If you give the labor unions too much power, it restricts profit and business and enterprise. And if you give the government too much power, it stifles both. And so what you have to have is a healthy system of checks and balances where the three are balancing each other and checking each other. And when we've gotten into trouble in the 20th century and the early 21st century in America in terms of our economic system, in my opinion, is because at sometimes business has had too much power, at sometimes government has had too much power, and at sometimes labor's had too much power, and that's when things get out of whack.
Boy, I'm just thinking, Richard, a lot of people are going to say you don't sound like a true conservative there, because in their mind, conservatives just can't stand labor unions. So here, I just think this is a good conversation. We're breaking out some of these stereotypes. And you know what we might be involved with as well, Richard, is changing the identity of what words like conservative and progressive mean. And maybe people like us, people of faith, are going to have some role in increasing the conscience of the whole spectrum of our public discourse. One last question before we probably should move on. What do you think we as evangelical Christians can do to help heal this divide? Do you think we should be involved in, and what do you think we can do?
Well, I think we need to foster conversations with each other where we listen to each other instead of talking past each other. And I think that we have to be very careful that we don't allow ourselves to be manipulated by political parties. Political parties by nature are profane. They are earthbound institutions. They are organizations that are put together for the sole purpose of getting more votes than the opponents have so that they can exercise power. That means they will exploit people of faith. That means they will take advantage of people of faith. It means that they will abuse people of faith if people of faith allow them to do so. And I look upon political parties as a necessary evil. I look upon government as a divinely mandated institution. In Romans 13, it says that God ordained the civil magistrate punish those who do evil and to reward those who do that which is right. But I see parties as a necessary evil that we have in this country in order to elect officials. But I don't think that pastors or religious leaders should ever endorse candidates. I think that we should be looking for candidates who endorse us and who endorse our values and who endorse our beliefs. And I think that when we fall over into allowing either the Republican Party to manipulate conservatively inclined evangelical Christians, and when the Democratic Party is able to come over and enlist and begin to exploit more progressive or liberal evangelical Christians, I think that we do a disservice to the body of faith.
Yeah, I like the way our mutual friend Jim Wallace puts it. He says, referring to Dr. King, a statement by Dr. King, we shouldn't try to be the master of the state or the servant of the state, but a conscience for the state, and that would certainly apply to our parties. And I think we've both seen some kind of ugly things about that in that regard in our own history. I was really struck by this a couple years ago. I wrote about this in a book of mine called Everything Must Change. I was going through the Holocaust Museum here in D.C., and on the wall there's a letter from Hitler's physician, and he was recounting a conversation he'd had with Hitler, and Hitler said, "We have to keep the war effort going, because as long as we have the war effort going, the churches won't complain and won't criticize us. This is the way we can keep our genetic work," and what he was really referring to as the extermination of mentally retarded people and the rest. And so you realize there's just a little place where that manipulation comes out. We really do have to be very careful of that.
Well, we do. In fact, the Third Reich is the most prominent example I use in my book in the chapter on what conservatives are getting wrong, because the Germans, particularly after World War I, in trying to explain why they thought God was on their side and they lost, they completely conflated being Christian with being German, and that worship of the state, or that worship of the folk, as they would call it, was then it was furthered by the fact that you had a real rise of a morally relative Christianity in the state church. And so you look at the confessing church led by Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth and others, and you find that they tended to be the ones who had not abandoned the idea that Christ was the focus of the church. And in fact, they said that there was only one Führer, and he was Christ. He was not Adolf Hitler. But you see what happens when you conflate being American or being German or being any nationality with being Christian, and you couple that with any denial of the absolutes that are laid down in Scripture, that you have to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto Christ the things that are Christ. And really bad things happen often in the name of the church and in the name of Christianity.
Well, I'll just say amen to that. Amen. That's exactly right.
Well, I think that we face particular challenges, Brian, in an election year. I think that when it comes to people of faith, that in an election year, let's just put it this way, the political parties are fishing with live bait. They are really out to do everything they can to try to co-opt people of faith for their cause in order to get their candidate elected. And I think that we have to be particularly careful when it comes to election years. I know that in the last presidential election cycle in 2004, I was sitting in my study here at the office and was reading a book, and I get a phone call from Reuters news agency. And they said, "What is your reaction to the fact that the Republican National Committee has called for church members to send in their directories from their local churches so that they can check them against the voter registration rolls?" And I said, "They did what?" I said, "Well, I'll tell you what." I said, "I'm absolutely against it." I said, "If you'll call me back in half an hour, I'll give you a statement that will glow in the dark." Well, I did, and I issued a statement calling upon Southern Baptists and other pastors to stand up in the pulpit and to say under no circumstances should you do this. This is a violation of the trust of the body. It's a violation of the trust of your fellow church members, and it is an absolutely unwarranted intrusion into the life of the local body of Christ.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased with the response because in an election cycle, when more than 4 out of 5 people who identified themselves as Southern Baptists voted for George W. Bush, I had not one pastor who disagreed with me. Of the hundreds of emails that I got, I had not one pastor and maybe 1 out of 10 lay people who disagreed with me. So I felt that was a positive sign, but it's the kind of thing that we must carefully guard against because, as I said, political parties are no better than they have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sadly that's the case. It reminds me, just a parallel story, Richard. I was in Southern California. I don't remember the dates, but the election was on Tuesday. So I was there on Friday, and I was stuck in a terrible traffic jam, no surprise, in L.A. And so I had the local Christian radio station on, which I understand is the biggest Christian radio station in the country in terms of the biggest listenership. And this was afternoon drive time, Friday afternoon. And here's what the guy said on the radio. He said, I want all of you listening to me today. I want you to leave your church service early on Sunday. And I want you to go into the parking lot of your church. And I want you to look for any car that has a Carrie Edwards sticker on it. And I want you to stand behind that car and don't let the person leave the parking lot until they answer this question. How can you justify voting for ungodly leadership? And then he said, I want you to call me on Monday and tell me what they say. And this was I was just astounded, for a whole lot of reasons, by this kind of thing on a Christian radio station. So we got a lot of work to do.
Well, we do. And the fact is that we have people who get paid a lot of money, who are very bright and very motivated, who are going to do everything they can to enter those boundaries and to exploit those boundaries and to manipulate people of faith for their particular candidate or their particular party. And this is the nature of parties, and it must be the nature of people of faith that we make certain that we do not allow ourselves to be exploited, we do not allow ourselves to be co-opted, we do not allow ourselves to be manipulated.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. It's interesting, isn't it? We can talk about left and right, and we know there are extremists and bad actors on both sides. The line between good and evil doesn't run between Democrat and Republican or whatever. There are some bad actors on all sides, and this is true in religion. This is true in politics, and to me, this helps me think about what my ideal would be in United States politics, and I'm sure this could be applied in other contexts as well. But if we had committed Christians in the Republican Party whose job is to tell the truth to the Republican Party about the things they're doing that they think are unethical, are unwise, are unhelpful to the country, are out of line with God's will as we best understand it. Now, obviously, we don't have any carte blanche. We can't pull out the God card and say you have to listen to me. But for us to speak from our convictions in the Republican Party and for us to do so in the Democratic Party, and that way, it seems to me, we who are committed followers of Christ, instead of seeing a Christian in the other party as our enemy, we could say, no, we're allies working together for the common good. And I think in that way, I can be glad there are people committed followers of Christ in both parties, as long as they're conscious of what you're warning us about, which is this danger of being manipulated.
This, what you've just said, really parallels what I said. I was asked to be part of a kickoff event for Jim's book, God's Politics, at the Brookings Institution, right after the election. I guess it was in mid-December. And they asked me to speak first, and I said, first of all, I'm really encouraged by this event. I'm encouraged by the reception that Jim's book is getting, and you could tell there were a few surprised looks on people's faces. And I said, the reason is there's been a three-way debate going on in this country for a couple of decades now between people like Jim Wallace and people like myself and people like Barry Lynn. And the reality is the debate may not be over, but Barry lost. And the people who say that religion does not have a role to play in the public policy issues that we face have lost that debate, that we do have a rightful role to play. And now we're going to have what I consider to be a far more fruitful and a far more beneficial debate, and that is a debate on how our religious convictions should and should not apply. And that's going to make Republicans better Republicans. It's going to make Democrats better Democrats. It's going to make independents better independents. And it's going to make Americans better Americans. And it's going to make the country a better country.
I couldn't agree with you more. What a great opportunity we have. But we're going to have to unlearn some old habits, aren't we? Because on both the liberal and conservative side, there are a lot of organizations that have their methodologies that they're well practiced in, and we're going to have to help people get out of some old reactive habits and get some new habits and practices of dialogue and persuasion, and we're going to have to get people to think a little more deeply. We shouldn't be concerned about that, though. That's kind of what the word repent means, isn't it? We've got to get people to think again.
Well, and we've got to really work hard at overcoming the media biases, because I think the media really does play a terribly destructive role in this. I mean, for instance, I routinely get described as someone who's a leader of the religious right.
Yeah.
And, my response to I try as patiently as I can to say, look, I am not a religious right leader. I am the elected head of the Public Policy and Moral Concerns Agency of the largest Protestant denomination in the country. Now, I applaud the religious right when they have the good sense to agree with us, as they seem to most often on the sanctity of human life issues, on the traditional family, etc. But we spend as much time and effort on racial reconciliation as we do on the sanctity of human life. We spend as much time on human rights and religious freedom here and abroad as we do on the traditional family. And so to try to narrowly put us into a compartment and say that we're religious right is just unfair and inaccurate. Well, of course, they listen to me patiently, and then they write religious right leader Richard Land.
That's right. And one of our big challenges is that kind of binary thinking that's so popular in the secular media also gets picked up in the religious media. And so we not only have to, we really do, you and I and people like us have a job to do to challenge Christians to think in some fresh ways about these issues.
Well, I agree. And I think that we need to take every opportunity that we can to do that, and to make it clear to our people, what our incessant mantra to our people in our denomination is: you need to be registered to vote. You need to be an informed voter, and we put all the campaign websites on our website, a link to them during the campaigns. And we have put up the two websites of the two presumptive nominees now. And when the two platforms are finished, we have had a history here at our commission. We take the issues that are within our purview. We don't necessarily think that trade issues are within our purview, but the issues that are within our purview, we take what the Republican Party platform says and what the Democratic Party platform says, and we put them side by side. We don't try to editorialize on it. We just give, this is what the parties say they're campaigning on. And then we say to our people, you need to be registered to vote. You need to be an informed voter. You need to vote. And when you vote, you need to vote your values, your beliefs, and your convictions. And that I would say that to a pro-choice person. I would say that to a pro-life person. I would say that to a person who is more of a free enterprise person on economic philosophies, and a person who's more of a government intervention person on economic policies. You need to vote your values, you need to vote your beliefs, you need to vote your convictions, and you need to prioritize within those what your first priority is and your second priority is. And I think that from the pulpit, we have the right and the responsibility to talk about what the Bible has to say about these issues. But, I'm a Baptist. I believe in the priesthood of the believer. It's up to each individual believer to wrestle out these issues with as much understanding as I can give them, and then they've got to decide.
We've obviously got enough topics that we'll have to do this again down the road here. But as we kind of bring this conversation to a close, you're reminding me, as you say that, of one of my favorite moments as a pastor. This might sound terrible, but I always loved the benediction. It wasn't because I was glad the service was over. But I always loved sending people out at the end of a service to go forth to love and serve the Lord. And I love the idea that around the country, pastors and other church leaders gather people together. We try to give them a deeper understanding with all the resources of Scripture and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. We try to give them a deeper understanding of what's going on in our world. Sometimes we succeed at that, sometimes we fail, but that's our calling. And then we want to send them out to live out that good news as teachers, as construction workers, as farmers, as computer professionals, and as citizens in this country. And to me, this is part. I think this conversation, I hope for people who listen, will give them some sense about our citizenship this year. That as Christians, we have a high calling, and as Christian leaders, we have to challenge people to deeper and more careful thinking, and not just give them a shortcut to.
I agree with you, Brian, and I think that part of it too is how we do it. I must. We all have pet peeves. Well, I must confess to you that one of my pet peeves are bigots. I have a hard time loving bigots. Now, I know that God loves them, but I have a hard time doing so. And Dr. King was particularly helpful to me on this point because, he used to say, those that you would change, you must first love.
Oh, that's
and if he can love Bull Connor, and he can love Sheriff Jim Clark, and he can love the Klansmen, then I can love them. And so I think that we have got to challenge people, and we've got to go out and not only ask our people to ask themselves, what would Jesus do? But part of that is we have to disagree with people without being disagreeable.
Yeah, that says it so well. I was in South Africa a year or so ago, and the groundskeeper at this Dutch Reformed church that I was visiting had been one of those bigots. And he thought that Nelson Mandela was nothing but evil, and he hated Desmond Tutu. And one time he was walking, and he was a really big guy, and he was walking down the concourse in an airport in Johannesburg or Pretoria, and Desmond Tutu, who's this little guy, he sees him walking in his clerical robes, and he just hates him. And so he walks up and nudges him with his elbow and knocks, because of his size, he knocked Tutu right down on the ground. And he just glared at him and just feeling hatred. And Tutu looked up at him and gave him this, almost mischievous, whimsical, loving smile and said, "God bless you, my son." And the man said he was just furious. But over those coming days, that act, that kind, smiling response to an act of aggression is what made him realize he was a bigot. And it's exactly as you say. Those we hope to bring change to, we have to love.
That's right.
Well said.
Well, Brian, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. I want to thank you for a very informative and a very challenging conversation.
I thank you as well, and I think we've got a lot of things to keep talking about, so I hope we can do this again.
Let's do it.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.